Down too. For those of you who are just joining us, welcome to the Online International Summit on Openness. And I'm Clark Shaw Nelson. I'm one of the co-hosts and co-chairs of this experience, along with
co-partners in crime, co-superhero detective. I'm Angela Gundner, and I've been just following Clark around for the day.
You know, we started early this morning here in Orlando, Florida, talking with folks from all over the world. We have been today. We started in Japan and heard about open and local contexts and the difference between the level of awareness versus the level of adoption in Japan. And also the hesitation to share that some folks have when they feel like maybe their material isn't good enough to put out into the world, in the open world. We also went to Africa and heard a lot about amazing work with sustainable development goals, SDGs, and the overarching
Maha just showed up too, so
awesome.
We can shout her out.
We heard about equity and listening to those who are the farthest from justice and equitable hospitality, courtesy of Mahabeli. And we also went to Europe and heard a little bit about communities of open and student voice and the importance of getting input from students into the whole openness perspective, as well as policy. And we've been trying to prod everyone a little bit to think about how policy might be changing in their local context as well, and the mandate for public funds and so on. Behind OER. And then we were just previously in South America, where it was fascinating to draw this together with the area of design and think about how designing for an unknown audience changes things, and thinking about audience and what is the audience, and how can you be inclusive in that. And moving from the cost perspective to social justice and equity. So now that brings us back to North America, and we'll have one more session after this, which will be this evening.
Yeah, we'll have a little bit of a break before we board our flight from North America, from the east coast of North America, to go all the way to Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. And we're going to close it out with a look at decolonizing open and getting some great perspectives that are synergistic with the many that Clark just shared, and also the many that we've captured in the collaborative doc throughout the day. So a bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to our amazing, amazing guests. I need words bigger than amazing. I'll come up with some before it's too long, but we are capturing all of the ideas that are generated in these sessions in this collaborative worksheet. We're in session 5 now, so I've given you a link that directly jumps you down to that segment. And what our speakers have done is they've put a series of resources and readings that they recommend connected to the provocations that they're going to give, which we're going to have a little bit of a on an annotation activity in the end. But sandwiched in the middle between provocation and annotation is a collaborative activity. And we have a series of questions that, for those of you that have been with us all day, you've heard my spiel already, but for those newly joining us, just know that we have this space dedicated to answer these questions about openness, particularly in your own context, and ideas that are generated based on the provocations of the speakers. They may inspire new questions that we look at too. So don't be surprised if I'm in the Google Doc changing and adding questions, and I encourage you to do the same. This is an open activity, ha 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 ha. The other really important thing to mention is that this worksheet is generating a white paper that we're going to publish. And once again, in the spirit of open, we could not do it without giving attribution to all of you who contribute to the conversation today. Sandwiched between actual ham. The puns in session 5, ripe for the picking. We would love for you in that contributors section to add your name and your contact information so that we can feature you for the good work that you're doing today within defining openness in global contexts. So without any further ado, and you know, before I break the wall and introduce our speakers, can you just remind me, are you both, yeah, okay, perfect. I saw the first slide, you gave me your answer of, y'all are a synergistic super force you're going to use your powers for good and not evil. So I know what to do. Okay. Terry's like, pretty much good. Good here and there. So we have Robin DeRosa, who's the director of the Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative, and we have Terry Greene, who is the digital learning advisor for Fleming College. And the two of them are going to talk to us about what comes around, goes around and around, and as Terry said, and around and around and around, around open. So over to you.
Cool. Well, thanks everybody. I will tell you that my colleague, Terry, up in the Great White North, has been in a conference all day long. So he's been jumping in where he can, but I participated. He's at TESS, which, you know, we love TESS. Hi, everybody. But I've been in and out of the sessions all day long with this group, and it's been like truly amazing. So one of the problems, of course, is like presenting later in the day is as I see each thing come up, I'm like, oh God, you know, I should go redo all of my slides. But we didn't. We're just gonna, so I think in some ways what we're doing is a departure from some of what we've seen before today, but I think a lot of the themes connect. And so I'll try to pull some of those out as we go through, because I've really enjoyed the presentations today. So Terry's clicking, we'll see what happens and what he's going to give me to work with, which is kind of a hint. There we go. So I am going to start by talking about something that lots of folks have heard me talk about before, because when I was thinking about how to kind of kick this off, and obviously like the idea, we've been joking on Twitter all day long about like, you know, thank God North America has finally represented, you know, figured out who its representatives are. But there's really no chance that we're going to be like representing open in North America. And open in North America has enjoyed some really sort of public fracturing this year. I personally don't think it's been particularly fractured, but it's been a really great conversation about that kind of stuff. So we're intentionally, I would say, not really talking about any of that, partially because I don't think it's really our place to represent the diversity of voices that are inside of open. I think instead, I want to talk a little bit about, instead of broadcasting, like telling you what open looks like here, or explaining the open projects that we're working on, I want to try to reverse that a little bit and talk a little bit about how open for me, and I think as you'll see for Terry, has been a little bit more about listening rather than telling. So I'm going to start talking about jump off from a project that I've talked about before, which is this project that I did many, many years ago, my first project in open with students, creating the open anthology of earlier American literature. And I just Googled that because I actually don't work with that anthology anymore, and I needed to get to the link. So I just do what I always do, which is I Googled. And it was so awesome to see like the Norton anthology come up, and right below it, like my open anthology that I worked on with these students. And I want to talk a little bit about that project and how it set a sort of mind shift for me in open, which I think is a mind shift that many people are talking about and interested in right now, which is the shift from looking at artifacts to looking at pedagogy and thinking about architectures for learning rather than thinking about the outputs that learning produces. So I'm going to start by talking about listening, which is the reason that this project really sort of took off, was that I was working with students who were paying a lot of money for a textbook. It actually probably doesn't sound like a lot of money compared to some textbooks, but at $90, it was too expensive for a lot of my students at this public rural college where I work. And we decided that we could probably create something digitally that would replace that textbook and be free. And it would take advantage of public domain literature, which is mainly what I taught given the chronology of my work. So I engaged in a project with students over the course of a summer where we built out this anthology of public domain literature, and it worked out great. The main thing was that we didn't particularly know what we were doing, except we wanted to save some money on this textbook. And so what we did is we sort of launched into the project, and talked a lot to each other about what the needs were. So we knew the need was to drive the cost down. So we tackled that need first. But then as the students were using the resource that they had helped to put together, we realized there were other needs that they had with the learning material that it wasn't offering. It didn't have footnotes, it didn't have images, it didn't have sort of ancillary materials to help students, maps, a lot of things that are really important. So of course, we started building those ourselves, right? Students started pulling that stuff into the book, and we started building it out. And it was in the course of kind of doing that we started broadening our thinking a little bit, instead of just thinking, how can we make this anthology even cooler? Because once we realized, my God, we could do anything to this thing, you know, it became like kind of an exciting project that we all enjoyed. But we also wanted to think like, wow, is this learning? Like, is this, instead of just learning from books, could we be learning with books and in books and against books? And that really fired us up quite a bit. And it got me excited about the parts of open licensing that really inspire me, which is less about sort of legal permission trading and more the questioning of what kind of knowledge community we want to build and how do we want to build it. And that's when I started realizing with my students, hey, we're not just critiquing and creating, you know, this American literature, we're also critiquing and creating the architectures for our own learning. We're asking questions about what is the role of profit in our educational system. We're asking questions about who gets to be the authority on, for example, what counts as American or what counts as literature. When we started working on the anthology, you know, we're a bunch of, you know, sort of rural, mostly New Hampshire folks. When other people started using our openly licensed resource, for example, in the South of the United States, they had a really different inflection on American history, for example. And then now that the book project has gone more international, and we have scholars from all over the world who are contributing to this, you know, what we've called in earlier sessions, what Jonathan Portz was calling ugly OER, right? It really started as this really, you know, we didn't know what we were doing. It was not a super high quality resource. But now that it's really gone international, we've got lots of people, scholars working on the project. We're also seeing lots of the places where we had gaps, right? In the way that we, for example, handled our native literature section, in some of the ways that we conceived of North and South America and Central America and what counts as the Americas. All of these things are deeply ingrained in American literature. And it was the collaborative process and the widening of lenses around open that helped us access all of this stuff. So I think one of the lessons for us was that, you know, we've been looking a lot through the course of today at local context and really trying to honor the fact that region inflects open and vice versa. But one of the cool things about that, and, you know, in the South American session, I think there were some really salient pieces, points about this coming up. It's not just about sort of honoring the context of, you know, how the OER is working. It's also about really celebrating the way the contexts rub against each other and create friction points, and keeping that learning material dynamic. I think it's kind of, you know, better for knowledge. It was certainly better for students to see American literature from 1400 to 1800 as actually literature that's very much dynamic and alive and in flux, right? These are not dead, stale documents. These are documents that people read and engage with in very different ways. So watching that project escape the bounds of our classroom was a great lesson, I think, for all of us. So I think one of the things I've thought about with open is, you know, sure, there was an OER at the heart of this particular, you know, project, but the OER, like, people ask me to borrow, you know, use the OER all the time. And I'm like, oh God, you know, why would you want to use this OER? Because the OER itself, at least the one we built, is truly not that exciting. It was really the process of thinking about knowledge as collaborative that was important. And also thinking about I would say inclusion more broadly. So for me, what this really did is it opened up the domains that I was spending most of my time teaching in. I think I'd always spent time in those middle domains of knowledge, understanding, and sort of thriving. I would think about those as like knowledge is like content transfer, and understanding is like, you know, can you repeat this back, but in your own words and like really feel like you get it. And then thriving would be maybe like you can apply it to a different situation or make connections. But for a lot of my students, the impetus of the project came from that first domain of survival. They were not particularly interested in having conversations about content in a book that they could not afford to buy. And they were spending a lot of time and energy just figuring out how to borrow it effectively or how to Xerox it on the fly. And that was taking a lot of their intellectual energy. So we dealt with that domain. It took a lot of pressure off of students. And then on the further end, we started thinking about, okay, after you can apply your knowledge and you understand the content, you've got access to this literature, what are the contributions that more diverse voices are going to make when they engage with this material? And how is American literature, even American literature from 1580, how is that literature going to be transformed when it's allowed to move from context to context and from learner to learner, and it's allowed to be shaped not just by authority, but by people who are actually learning and communicating with each other. So that's a little project that I did that transformed how I think about open and made me think less about artifacts and more about collaboration. And I'm going to turn it over to my fabulous colleague, Terry, who I think is going to make some connections to his own work. And then hopefully, Terry, you'll let me just take it for 1 second at the end with a little coda that's going to blow everybody's mind.
Oh my God, could just do it right now. Hi, everybody. I'm Terry. I'm in Toronto right now at the, if you want to see my credentials, I'm at the TESS conference that eCampus Ontario puts on. And I just want to tell you how listening to Robin can get you to Italy. So in fall 2016, in my very first open education event, I was sitting there in the crowd listening to, and I believe it was just a short kind of mini series of keynotes, and Robin came up and told us about that exact project, the anthology. And Robin sharing her experience and her mind shift did it to me too. And it made me, it convinced me to take the same shift in my context. So, and I should put a bow in this to say that project in the end is sending me, unfortunately, I have to represent the project in Milan at the Open Education Awards at the Open Education Global Conference next week. And just want to plug, if you see some award out there that you think you've done something that should be recognized, nominate yourself because it works. Okay, so step one, again, listen to someone like Robin. I was sitting in the room in Richmond, and Robin's, sorry, I'm just looking at, we don't feel bad.
I'm sorry, but I'm wearing the same shirt, so I'm just gonna go like this right now.
I've done that.
That's so embarrassing. I only have one presentation outfit, and now you're seeing it.
Can I enlarge the picture? Let's see, hold on. Anyway, so the project inspired me, and I knew back at Fleming College, we wanted to do something different with faculty development, and I thought, let's put our spin on this in our context and do something similar, as in collect the, have everybody contribute, not just us feeding the information down. So I borrowed her ideas and replicated it, put our twist on it, and began to replicate it in our project. And it's called the Open Faculty Patchbook. We call it a community quilt of teaching and learning, a community quilt of pedagogy. We put out a list of topics, suggested topics that people were like, yeah, I'll take that one. And then they gave you something completely different than what they said. But that was awesome because they came back with their kind of true stories of their true stories of their teaching and learning. And then we put it all together. We collected the posts on a blog, a WordPress blog, as they came in, and then worked them together into a, I don't know if I'm getting kicked out of this room. I'm not going to leave. Into a press
Don't
book.
let them reject you, Terry.
Okay, I'm okay. Sorry, and stand my ground. So we kept collecting them and put them together into a thing that we say it doesn't cover all of pedagogy, but we're starting to cover it by collecting these patches into a quilt. So by collecting contributors, I just wanted to point out that this is where I think this project did something nice in that it gave people a place to for the first time openly publish their thoughts about teaching and learning. I asked, like, about probably half or more of the patches come from Fleming College staff and faculty, and but the rest come from anybody was welcome and still are welcome to contribute. But I just spent all my free time wandering around. Whenever I ran into someone, I said, "Can you make one? Can you make one? Can you make one? Can you make one?" And so I got like a real breadth and depth of types of contributors from Fleming specifically. Like the president did one, and some deans, a couple deans, but also like a program technician who didn't think that his thoughts on pedagogy maybe were because that's not his job, isn't the pedagogy of the program. He's the technologist, but you know, and he had some amazing thoughts, and so of course let's add them in. And all together, there's just these great stories, and you get to know people's context, and it's pretty cool. So when I knew I was going to go to Milan to accept the award, I knew I had to do a 5-minute thing like this. So I sent a little survey, a 1-question survey out to all the contributors, asking them what convinced them to be involved. And amongst other things, most of it was Terry's nagging that convinced people to actually contribute. Nate, are you going to do one? Sorry, that's just a little nagging. No? Okay. So this is a big piece of getting these projects going, is some incessant but good-natured nagging. And of course, give attribution to where the ideas came from, attribution to the contributors, the gentle nudge. That's a band name, I like that. And I don't know, just in general, if you want to make an open education project work, it's got to be, you got to push, you got to keep pushing is, I guess, my point, but also acknowledge who's involved. And so this is kind of my meme version of the provocation, is poking you with a stick. Let's just share something and we can do it together. So let's see that coda. Let's hear it.
The coda, and this is a surprise for you, and I'm not putting it in the Google Doc, I'm just putting it in the chat because we haven't released it yet, but I'll just say it here in front of only my close friends, which is that, so Terry's project, you know, I think it's funny that he credits that project from coming from the Open Anthology of Early American Literature, which has, like, to me, no connection at all, but he made a connection. But we created a project this year, which pretty much owes everything to the faculty Patchbook, which, you know, technically he says came from my project, but you know, so it's really just going around and around. And I think when Terry says share something, you know, it's not a thing. That's not what you're sharing, right? It's not that you're sharing an artifact and letting somebody revise it. You're opening a question and inviting people to engage with it. And to me, that's a profound and perhaps, you know, utopian democratization of knowledge. And I think, you know, there's all sorts of reasons why it doesn't actually work like that, and why I think open needs to acknowledge the ways that its, you know, system of sharing is, complicated and fraught, not truly utopian. But to me, those are the stakes. They're much, much higher than whether or not a resource is free or openly licensed. It's the question of how you're thinking about knowledge and who has the authority to engage with it and who has the right to claim to be educated, and whose relationships count, and all of these things that I think we've heard from lots of the presenters today. Some of the work I think that's really been happening in North America that's excited me most this year is about the role of values in open education and the role of values in defining or conceptualizing a commons. A commons without values, we know, can be easily exploited. So how do you talk about values without, closing people into something that feels stifling or homogenous? So these are the things that I'm wrestling with, and why I love collaborating with somebody like Terry, because for me, it's all about the relationship and the continued expansion of how I think about things that I get by working with people.
I forgot one level of the what goes around comes around and around and around. I released a second patchbook called the Open Learner Patchbook to hear the actual learner stories and how they do their learning, regardless of how teaching happens. And the first two of the first three were written by Robin's students. So is it Inception at this point?
I don't even like Terry. I don't even know how this happened. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. So I think that's what we have, and we super welcome questions and talking through the doc and whatever else.
Yeah, we had people have just jumped in with all the love in the world, 2 feet, full head. I don't know what the jumping into the pool metaphor should be. It's late in the day, but they've done all of that in the Google Doc and have already started to write quite a bit. So no invitation necessary for this session. This has been wonderful. And Nate did pop in the chat a request to have Terry, for you to talk about the difference between the various patchbooks for folks. And while Terry talks about that, I would invite all of you to start peppering the chat with questions for Robin and Terry as well.
So there's two URLs, openlearnerpatchbook.org and openfacultypatchbook.org. So I guess that's the dichotomy. But if the more faculty ones come in and the more we tag them and categorize them, you could begin to have one like that's specifically to instructional design or specifically to UDL or whatever. But because they just kind of at this point trickle in slowly and just are just added as they come, it's just a quilt that's getting bigger and maybe going off the side of the bed, but it's still, you can double fold it, be extra warm. And then the student one is there's not as many of them. I think I don't know if it's trickier to keep that one like the life going because students, the ones that submitted first might be just long gone into their career at this point and not really worrying about the student world at this point. So it's definitely a different beast, but I would just welcome continuing to collect any story that comes out and seeing where it goes.
And then is there a difference between the WordPress site and then the Pressbooks version that you created on for the Open Faculty Patchbook?
So yeah, the original plan was that we wanted to make it into a Pressbook so that we could print it and make it a book and hand it to newly hired faculty at Fleming and say, here, your peers made this for you about how we do this stuff. And we did do that. So it's basically kind of a snapshot of the first 20 or so. At this point, it could probably put out the sequel if we wanted to. So there are a few hundred printed versions of the book that we have around that are it's cool to have that printed version of it. But yeah, it's a kind of a snapshot of the first big push of patchbooking.
Awesome.
And I'll let Terry look at that question from Kathy in the chat while I say one thing about the SDGs. My colleagues at Keene State in New Hampshire have just launched a big Wikipedia project where we're gonna, I think between us, seed about 15 or so faculty working with WikiEDU on doing Wikipedia editing around the SDGs. And so we got a big poster of the SDGs, and maybe someone can also put a link in the chat to the SDGs, just so other people can catch up. But we have a big thing in our faculty development area that I run now about that. And we're really trying to do more, because some of the stuff I've seen when I've been doing more international conferencing is, you know, really realizing how much traction these are getting globally, and that I totally agree that in the US, we're not hearing as much, and especially with so much of a focus on interdisciplinarity in our higher ed institutions, it's just, it would be so helpful to so many of us to know more about how those are working.
Actually, one of the early patches was it's called Mapping the UN Sustainable Development Goals to Learning Outcomes by Jenny Heyman, who's, she might have left by now. She has to get back to Sudbury. She's here at this conference. And I think that work in the patch that she did, it was definitely a part of her ongoing work towards her PhD, which she now has.
There was an earlier conversation today when in the session within Africa, and Maha actually brought this up too, how there is sort of an imbalance of conversations about, and a little bit of a disconnect, I guess, depending on context and location around the SDGs, where some locations in particular seem way more embedded within them in their practices, regardless of whether they're open or not, and then other locations are just now finding them and coming to incorporate them within practices. So I think it's certainly a framework that we can use to start doing a lot of the work that we've talked about today. And it makes me think too about some of the comments that Robin, you made at the very end about power and about authority and agency, and how quite often within settings within education, especially, we don't necessarily question how we got to places where folks' power and agency and authority are taken away from them, or attempted to to be removed from them. So I think that, you know, us creating spaces where we can have conversations like this to illuminate all of the inequity that we either don't see, or we just sort of keep on going and not necessarily reflect it, is incredibly important. The culture work, the work that we do to create the safe spaces where we can actually start to chip away at the challenges is important, and we can't do the one before the other. It has to be in that order.
This makes me think too about another sort of salient conversation, particularly in the US, and it even changes a little bit when I go in between the US and Canada because of how higher ed is organized, but there's such a massive push to privatize our public institutions in the US right now. And a big question I have about all of this is, what is the role of, what's the connection between a public and say a commons, or a public and say open? Between a public and privacy. So we're used to thinking about these things in very simple relationships, but I think as I see my own institution, which is a public institution, sort of rapidly becoming a private institution in so many ways, all of those areas get murky. And I wonder, you know, how to talk about public work and what its link is to social justice. And it reminds me a little bit also of some of the work that people have done with like Indigenous licensing, or Tara Robertson, who has that great work on when the lesbian porn stuff from the 70s was digitized and made open. You know, what are the times in which, you know, openness actually counteracts some of the values that we might consider to be important to the commons. So these are all things I'm trying to tease out to figure out, you know, if we could crack this nut, could we also come up with some ideas for how we define public education in a historical moment that I think doesn't really have a way of understanding what that is.
Yeah.
if you have the answer on that, please just like DM me later.
Clark has it. He's typing it up right now.
Yeah. Well, I'll just answer that with a question. No, actually, I just have a question. So I've been asking everyone, and I think Robin has caught several of these already today, but I've been trying to get a handle as we go around the world on policy and law and legal aspects. And I know even in the United States, we have a variety of differences state by state in terms of state universities and so on, and what some of the laws and policies are regarding openness and grant funded projects and so on, and what you need to share. And even in the last, I think, I'm not sure, but I think in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been more in the US regarding when you get federal grants and so on and use federal funds, that certain things have to be done in terms of sharing them openly or licensing with Creative Commons. But I was wondering, Terry, for example, if you could share a little bit about that in Canada. I heard something on this show called Getting Air about this. It's a great podcast. You probably wouldn't have heard of it, but something about this Z something. Can you talk about that a little bit?
The Z creds?
Yeah, Z creds. That's what it is.
Sorry, I was totally trying to find the Terry Robinson thing that Robin mentioned, so I missed a bit of the question. But Z creds, we should have Rajiv here because his institution is killing it with those. But an entire credential, I think maybe Canada might be behind a little bit because we took us time because we wouldn't say Z degree here. It doesn't make any sense. We don't understand what you're saying. So we couldn't think of, it took us a while to think of what rhymes with Z until some brilliant genius, I don't know who, thought of Z cred, which sounds awesome. And it also is more inclusive of different kinds of credentials, not just degrees, right? So now we started behind, but we'll pull ahead at some point soon because anyway, they're a full credential where there's no cost for any extra resources. There might be some out there that are just like that by accident, but they should, market themselves as Z creds because it's a great idea. And Kwantlen in Vancouver or the Vancouver area where Rajiv has just been like putting out. It seems like they put out one new one every day. I don't know. It's crazy.
And this was just an initiative that people just started doing essentially, or was there any sort of legal or policy type thing that drove this, or any states, for example, or provinces or whatever in Canada, whatever you have there, along with different letter names?
We have provinces and 3 territories,
Okay.
But I'm not sure where it started, but I do know California with their ZTCs, I think, and James Galapagos-Clag would know a lot. They're doing a ton of work in this area. We just have a cooler name for it, I think.
And a lot of the community colleges in the US are some of the places where this stuff was first birthed, because with the 2-year degrees that are more at the 1 and 2,000 level or 1 and 100 and 200 level courses, there's more OER for that stuff. So places like Tidewater Community College, for example, started moving lots of their programs to zero cost for learning materials. And in the US now, you're seeing lots of places that have, if not Z degrees, they have low cost and no cost courses that are marked by their registrars. And we are also seeing, of course, lots of states that are starting to do OER procurement for K-12. And we're starting to see states like, New York, or some of the states out west, like Washington, I believe, that are where the legislatures are doing more to support open. So like State University of New York and City University of New York got $8 million from their state to fund open. One of the challenges, I think, with some of that stuff that flows from the legislature, which is great, it's part of what we want to see as partnerships, in my opinion, but public, governments and institutions. But sometimes, just like the promise of like tuition freezes, say, at institutions that are really tuition dependent because state funding has been so anemic, there will be resolutions that come down that want faculty to use or consider OER, but there isn't a lot of respect for the academic labor that it takes to do the work involved with open. As you can see from the projects we're talking about here, they're really pedagogical shifts, they're mind shifts. So it's one thing to adopt a 100 level biology open textbook and just go, but that's a small portion of courses that can be serviced that way. And it's also unlikely to have some of the benefits that we also want to see by moving to open, which have to do more with inclusion and agency and transformation of the knowledge commons or shifting of academic publishing infrastructure, any of that stuff. So a lot of times the stuff that comes down like that doesn't really make space for the kinds of investments we need in order to do it well.
Awesome. We should probably go over to Nate to talk a little bit about the annotation at this point. Huh?
Yes, we want to make sure that we fit that in, and we'll have a little bit of housekeeping at the end, but Nate, over to you.
Oh, you caught me unaware, so I wasn't ready to talk. Yeah, so the interesting thing about this session is that the provocateurs and provocateuses, I guess, are very involved and engaged in annotation already. And so you'll notice that in the collaborative Google Doc, where both Robin and Terry have added recommended readings and resources. Wow, that's 3 R's, and hard to say. In each case, we've tried to provide not only a link to the resource, but a link to the resource with annotation enabled. But in all the cases that Robin supplied, the resources that she supplied already have annotation embedded in them natively. So that was really cool to see. And that's partially true for Terry's stuff as well. But we put in links or annotations so that if you follow those links with annotation through, every page you visit will have annotation enabled on it. And I just wanted to share for anybody who's in the audience here who isn't familiar with Hypothesis, the open source annotation framework for collaborative web annotation. If you don't already have a free account, here's a link that I'll put into chat where you can go get one. You don't need an account to view annotations that other people have made, but if you want to create your own annotations or reply to annotations, you need to have an account. And the way Hypothesis works is Hypothesis annotation comes to the document wherever it lives. So in the case of the resources Robin shared, people there have already enabled annotation on those resources. But in the case of Terry's, annotation isn't enabled in them natively, and so you bring it to those resources with your browser. So you can actually equip your browser to carry annotation with you sort of wherever you go. But we tried to provide links here so that people can visit these resources easily without having to do extra gymnastics to enable annotation. And the idea here being that we can extend the conversation that we're having here today on top of these documents going forward through this social collaborative annotation channel, if you will. And so we probably won't have time here today to dive in and annotate anything in specifically, although you're welcome to. But as we produce the white paper out of all the materials that have been collected in this international summit, one of the things that I'm imagining, and I don't know if Angela and Clark have thought of this already, but would be a kind of bibliography of all the resources shared, and that would be a bibliography that's enabled with annotation so that the rich set of resources can be annotated in an ongoing way. So at any rate, I will shut up, and I will just also offer that I'm around here all day, and my contact information is in the collaborative Google Doc. If anybody needs a little extra help with annotation, no question is too small for me to answer. Always happy to talk about it more, and I'll drop it there and let us get back to the regular conversation.
So, indeed. Thank you, Nate, for that. We are definitely going to make sure that we have a nice follow-up. Oh, we got the dub back. You could leave it on. Leave on Mad Professor. I'm cool. Just a big thank you, Nate, for that. We're going to have another gathering where we can open annotate, and there have been some great questions too in the chat about the format of the white paper that comes out. We're looking to do a white paper that's a synthesis across all sessions, although we will highlight integral pieces of the sessions granularly, because there are themes that are distinct. We want them to stand apart and recognized for what they are. I also want to mention too that just the piece that Nate mentioned now about the layers of annotation being part of the layers of a conversation that is going throughout time, that white paper is the next step in the continuation of these conversations. And we would want open annotation to be a part of that as well, so that we're not saying that there's an end point. There's no end. We're continuing this. And last but not least, just an open invitation to everybody. If you want to help with the process of synthesizing the data that we come up with today, please reach out to Clark or myself. Our contact information is on the bottom of the OLC Live and the Online International Summit websites, so you can get that information there. We'll also make sure that we leave it in this Google Doc that we're writing in as well, because I know some of you are coders, some of you are really into getting into the details and the minutia, and we would love to have you help us sift through the amazing and profoundly impactful ideas that have come up in this summit. I think, oh, and Robin, you know, we're all about the plug here. In fact, in past sessions, people have been plugging different events that are extensions of Open. So please, if you want to talk a little bit about the Digital Pedagogy Lab for a second, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I want to tell you about my GoFundMe account. No, I'm just kidding.
I
have 2 plugs. Well, 3 plugs. The Open Faculty Patchbook, who I'm sure is happy to publish you. Also, the Open Pedagogy Notebook is very happy to publish you. So you can find that online and submit your stuff. And then Martha Burtis and I are teaching a week-long Introduction to Open Pedagogy in Denver this summer at Digital Pedagogy Lab 2020. So you can ping me if you want some more information about that as well.
Ping her, lest you regret it. I mean, Terry led this off by saying, listen to Robin, connect with Robin, great things will happen. So thank you to both of you, or profound thanks, Robin and Terry. Yep, all the love. And thanks to each of you that participated in this session. This is the biggest session that we've had so far. We're gonna take a quick break between this and our next session. We have a couple of things that we have to do here at the conference, but we're gonna be coming back at 7:45. Let me make sure the time is right. Okay, 7:45 p.m. Eastern time. This is one not to miss. Our friends Sarah Lambert and Joanna Funk are going to be joining us from Australia to talk about decolonizing open, and the work that they have to share with us is not only profound, but it brings us full circle for a lot of the different themes that I've come up with throughout the day. So if you can stay up, if you can stay awake, if your time zone allows it, I would highly recommend that you come and join us for that. That will be closing out the Online International Summit for today, but just as we mentioned, that conversation is still going to be thriving and going strong. It also is not the close of OLC Live. So the next 3 days, we have a full schedule. For those of you that have been following all sorts of things open for quite a long time, you'll enjoy our first salon that we have tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern time with Adam Kroom and Ben Scragg, and we're going to talk about merging the worlds of open and design practices together, particularly visual design practices, and what that looks like for that Venn diagram to come together. We also have a design battle at 3:45 tomorrow that is openly themed, thanks to Nate. We'll have several teams competing against each other to be there to watch the bloodbath of open. That's an interesting hashtag. Somebody might have fun with that. And we have virtual speed networking lounges each day that are going on. On Thursday, we have the escape room. If you know what it was about that. So Clark and myself in the future, we're going to be joining you from year 2525. You're welcome to do that. And last but not least, we're going to be closing out OLC Live with Remy Kalir, who is fantastic. And we're going to be talking about all things open annotation. So full schedule, everything's free. Everything is available to folks. So if you have colleagues that you think should miss out and you want to give them an early Christmas present, ask them the schedule and we'll see what happens. All right, we'll catch you guys at the last one. Coming so very soon, but thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.